And I'd like to first begin with certain definitions and invite. We've heard about food justice, food security, and food sovereignty. We hear them used interchangeably. Are there any differences? And do any of these differences have any relevance to the environmental movement?
Well, Chaumtoli, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear completely what the question was, but I'm thinking that it's around the differences between food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. And so, just to give us instant potted history, the idea of food sovereignty emerges in the 1990s, coming from a social movement called La Via Campesina. And what they're doing is saying, look, we understand that food security it emerges from neoliberalism. Food security is the idea that you can have access to enough food for a healthy life. But the problem with food security is that you can be food secure in prison. And the idea of food security is, yeah, sure. I mean, if you're in prison, if you have a warder who is benevolent enough, you'll get your resources and be able to live a healthy, active life. But you'll still be in prison. You have no say over how it is that food gets to you. You have very little control over that. And the idea of food sovereignty is, well, actually what we need is control over the policy-making process, because otherwise we'll never actually get to food security. And so the idea that Via Campesina had is to say, look, neoliberalism actually prevents us from achieving a condition where everyone gets to eat and the right to food is achieved, because we are being locked out of the policy-making process. It's being turned into a neoliberal game. So certainly there's a huge distinction between food sovereignty and food security. Food security is the outcome, and La Via Campesina says, look, if you're serious about achieving food security, then neoliberalism isn't going to do it for you, because neoliberalism distributes food on the basis of ability to pay, and the ability to pay is no basis for achieving what ought to be a right. So there's a world of a difference between food security and food sovereignty. Food justice is a term that's particularly prevalent in the United States, and it has a different kind of genealogy. The genealogy in the United States is more akin to the idea of histories of the environmental movement. The environmental movement was often concerned, and in some places today still is concerned, with preserving an environment without people, and particularly without people of color on it. And the environmental justice movement emerged really in response to essentially a racist environmental movement through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, pointing out that some of the worst environmental problems in the United States were often in areas where people of color and poor people were living. And so the environmental justice movement sticks on the idea of justice and of remedy to historical inequality as a way of reminding people that if you really are serious about these ideas about environmentalism, that you really want to come at it with a framework of justice. Food justice is about the same thing. It's about reminding us that certainly in the United States, we live amid histories of deep inequality, and those need to be addressed if we are to achieve the idea of food security for everyone. But I do think that there's kind of a confluence, even though La Via Campesina is a peasant movement in large part, driving ideas of food sovereignty, and food justice is a movement that comes from urban roots. I think that they move towards the same kinds of ideas around needing to be in control of the process, of being very concerned with equality, particularly gender equality, and understanding that food security, this idea that everyone gets to eat, is something that is an outcome after a long process of struggle.
And so both the issues of food justice and food sovereignty connect us to an examination of environmental sort of saying and being able to control the production. Because you talked about the economy, but if you can talk a little bit about how these notions of democracy, which I put on the Facebook event page, these are about democratic questions of controlling sort of the production as well. So I'm just wondering if you connect both the justice and sovereignty terms to issues about production and in terms of the environmental movement. Like, I mean, I hope you're here being able to hear my question.
So yeah, I mean, it's easy enough to think about democratizing consumption, right? I mean, because food security is about, at the end of the day, is a consumption discussion. To be food secure is, as I say, to be able to consume whether you're in prison or not. That's an output on that side. But to control food policy and to understand that we need justice in the making of food policy and in the making of understanding the architecture of the food system, then all of a sudden we need to be having discussions around things like who controls the seed, what kind of farming system works well, how do we support farmers, what kinds of interventions make sense, how do we distribute land, how is it that there's been deep inequality, for example, in the United States around the takeover of land and the concentration of power in control over land in the United States. And so all of a sudden, if we're having a conversation around food sovereignty or around justice, to be honest, in the United States, we can't really talk about about fairness without addressing the historical injustices that have brought labor to the United States and have stolen land from First Nations in the United States. Then all of a sudden we do get into the production side of things. But that's what both the justice element and the sovereignty element have in common, is that they're looking not just about how it is that you control or have a say in consumption, but it's about the whole arc of not only production and how it is that we democratize, making sure that everyone has access to land and has access to good research for agroecology, but also to be thinking about how do we think about sovereignty and justice over marketing, for example. I mean, a lot of what it is that we're encouraged to eat today is highly processed food. There's a control over the culture of our food system that is controlled by corporations, and democratizing that and reigning justice in over that is equally important.
So I want to encourage those who are listening, if they have to ask it now. You'll be sort of leaving us in about 10, 15 minutes. I want to shift to Sara. Your work with Grassroots, both the global north, United States, as well as the global south. Some of the things that Raj has been saying in terms of justice and sovereignty, do you see global partners, and how so? Give us a sense of the kind of work around food issues and the environment that you're seeing across the globe.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And I want to start by just saying it's such a pleasure to be part of this discussion with you, Chaumtoli, and Raj and Phil. I think the questions you're bringing up and the experience that you all have on these issues is really important, and so I'm humbled to be part of this with you. And I'm glad that there's a broader community that's part of this conversation too. But yeah, to those points, I think, Raj, you gave a really great explanation of the differences between the terms and their evolution. In terms of food sovereignty, for folks who are less familiar with La Via Campesina that Raj mentioned, this is the group that really created this concept. This is an international movement of over 250 million families that are small-scale farmers, peasants, farm workers, fisher folk, small-scale food producers around the world in over 70 countries. And that's one of the groups that we partner with at Grassroots International.
Hello?
Yes. Can you hear okay? Okay, I'm going to keep going.
Yes.
Go
ahead.
Their work around food sovereignty, I think, that's the concept really comes from the Global South. And it's a concept that has been gaining more traction in the Global North as well, and in the U.S. As well. And I think, food justice, for the reasons that Raj described, also has a real important meaning here in the U.S. So I think where with food sovereignty, there's a clear critique of the current economic system, which is capitalism, and a recognition that we need, hi, Phil, a recognition that we need an alternative economic system, and also recognition of the role of patriarchy and the importance of challenging that and building up women's leadership for food sovereignty. I think with food justice, particularly in the U.S., there's a real important role in bringing up racial justice for the reasons that Raj described. And so I think, in the Global North context, there's a kind of bringing together of that analysis. from the global south and from the global north, of the particular ways that different forms of oppression have created injustices in the food system, and the ways that we have a vision to build something new and different. And I think with both concepts, with food sovereignty and food justice, there's a real connection to the environmental issues you're bringing up. So we know that industrial agriculture system is a system that is responsible for between 44 to 56% of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. That's something that the International Research Institute, GRAIN, has calculated when we take into account not only the food production and transportation, but also land use change. Taking huge swaths of land to plant monocrop corn and soy to feed animals or to feed cars. And when you take into account packaging and waste, all those different things, it's a huge part of the reason that we're in the climate crisis that we're in. So that's both a real awakening, a call to help us see why the food system is so integrally connected to environmental issues and environmental justice issues. And I think it's also the bright side is that through food sovereignty, food justice, agroecology, we actually have the power to really make huge changes to bring environmental justice and climate justice by both building resilience. So communities, for example, in Haiti that we partner with, the peasant movement of Papai, they are a group that's also part of Via Campesina that has a clear analysis of how climate change is impacting Haitians in a really severe way. That's no coincidence that a lot of the communities that are experiencing the first and worst impacts of climate change are in the global south, are black communities, and also other communities of color around the world. And their solution is around promoting food sovereignty and agroecology. And they're seeing that as something that can make them more resilient to climate impacts to come, but that can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that hopefully the kinds of the level of the crisis won't be as bad as it could be. But it's a big fight, and I think we're seeing increasing connections between the food sovereignty movements and climate justice movements, and that's I think for me one of the biggest sources of hope.
Yeah, so thank you guys. I'm in Dhaka for those, and actually all of us I think are in different states and localities. So for any, I want to apologize in advance to participants. But maybe I'll pose a question to either Sara or Raj around how does the GMO seed preservation, I think Raj talked about it a little bit. I know that some of the global partners that are international have been mobilizing around GMO issues, more so in the global south than I am aware of in Europe. But how does that factor into our conversation?
So for folk who are unfamiliar with what genetically modified organisms are, the Cliff Notes version is that these are plants that are largely owned and propagated by the pesticide industry. They are plants that are either designed to withstand a certain kind of herbicide known as glyphosate, or to produce a herbicide from, or rather produce a pesticide from within the leaves of the plant, a pesticide known as BT. And depending on the plant, the idea is that either it sort of repels a particular kind of insect, or it's a kind of plant that you plant in long rows, and then you spray this magic herbicide that kills absolutely everything except this one plant. So that already points to the kinds of ways in which genetically modified organisms get used. They are monocultures. They are part of industrial agriculture where you're planting one of everything and long rows of commodity crops. And those major crops are corn, soy, and cotton are the major genetically modified organisms. So there are others as well. Now, what that involves is a concentration of power and a concentration of knowledge in the farming system. So it's not just about one seed company selling you seed year after year after year, which is true, and that's one of the ways in which that's part of the business model of industrial agriculture. The problem runs deeper than that. It's an environmental problem because the herbicide that's used, glyphosate, has now been basically coming to the end of its useful life. There are more and more weeds that are resistant to it, and we're now moving on to the next in a range of herbicides, going back to something like atrazine, which is incredibly damaging pesticide, and now we're having 2,4-D, a pesticide that's part of Agent Orange, now being approved for use in U.S. fields alongside a plant that is resistant to it. The sort of arms race of pesticides is good for nobody. Particularly, it's bad for farm workers, but it's bad for everyone to have these kinds of chemicals in the environment. But it's also an assault on the imagination of how we might grow food differently in the future. And I think Sarah's in a great position to talk about how there are lots more farming systems than just industrial monoculture that we can be turning to. And I think one of the problems with the world of GMOs is that they constrain and monopolize our imagination about how it is we might farm differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that, Raj. And so yeah, our partners are definitely experiencing a lot of the threats that are coming from both GMOs and monocultures in general, the industrial agriculture or corporate agriculture system, and are creating the other forms of agriculture that are healthy for people and the planet. And so yeah, a few examples of both. The resistance, one example is in Mexico. After over a decade of struggle, and there's continued struggle, but there was a big victory a little over a year ago when movements were able to at least temporarily stop the commercial planting of GMO corn. So that's something that, corn is coming from Mexico. That's the origins, and there's such a huge biodiversity of different kinds of corn that are, incredibly nutritious, that are adapted to particular regions, that are culturally so significant. In Mexico, people say, without corn, we have no country. We are corn. We are made of corn. And so, you can imagine a corporation coming in and saying, we're going to just propagate this genetically modified corn that we control. Farmers don't control the seeds, and the systems for thousands of years that farmers have used to sustain themselves and their communities are under a lot of threat. So both peasant and indigenous movements together, and it's actually, I think, one of the most inspiring things about this story is that it's really brought together movements of peasants and indigenous peoples that sometimes have been at odds, to see, kind of a common vision, a common struggle. And so there was a court decision that temporarily stopped commercial planting of GMO corn. It's an ongoing struggle, and we'll have to keep on working with those movements and taking action in solidarity with them. But they're really courageous in defending their seeds. In Guatemala, similarly, movements of peasants and indigenous peoples were able to prevent passage of what's called a Monsanto law, which would have allowed for more privatization of seed systems. And what we're seeing in a lot of places around the world is actually criminalization of seed sharing. So it's going beyond just trying to promote the corporate seeds, whether they're GMOs or just hybrids. It's also about saying, the systems that peasants and communities and indigenous peoples have used for generations and hundreds and thousands of years are illegal, are becoming illegal. To just simply save your seeds and give them to your neighbor and exchange them, that's becoming illegal. So this is the kinds of threats that we're seeing where corporations are more and more trying to take over just the basic elements of life that are necessary to have food sovereignty: land, seeds, water. So the resistance coming from the ground up is really important.
Yeah.
And Raj, as you mentioned, people are both resisting and they're building, they're creating, they're envisioning what we want and constructing that. So in addition to the example I talked about in Haiti, this is what people are doing around the world. In West Africa, there's a campaign called We Are the Solution. And it's a campaign of rural women's associations in 5 countries in West Africa, including Burkina Faso, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Senegal. And these are women who are saying, you know what, the Gates Foundation and others involved with the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, they're trying to tell us that they have a solution to hunger and to climate change. They're trying to tell us that their package of corporate seeds and pesticides and herbicides and chemical fertilizers are what we need. But we know that's not what we need. We know that we have the solutions from our traditional practices in agriculture and new things that we're learning that combines with science, with learning from different communities. That's what agroecology is. That includes the biodiverse seeds, that includes water conservation, that includes crop rotation, that includes working with livestock and compost, that it's really a whole circular system. It includes agroforestry. It's all these different elements. And it's locally adapted. Each different place has different needs and has different practices that work best in that local place. But it's also internationally connected. So, people in a dry area of Brazil can connect with people who are in a dry area of India. And we had actually an exchange last year in Brazil where bringing together people from movements in South Africa, in India, in Brazil, in Mexico, to share their practices in agroecology and learn from one another. So I think we're seeing that becoming more and more wanted, becoming more, people wanting to be able to learn from one another and share their practices and also strategize, because a lot of the threats that they're facing are coming from a similar place. And so people can say, oh, well, how did you get this policy in Goiás, in the state of Brazil, where the state actually compensates you for producing your own Creole seeds and buys them from you and gives them to other farmers? That's a model that a lot of people were really interested in learning from a group called the Popular Peasant Movement in Brazil. And so I think there's all kinds of examples like that that are great for us to learn from here in the U.S. and for people to share more with.
So I just want to give you a chance to say some concluding words.
Well, Bob, but I mean, I just want to endorse absolutely everything that Sarah says. The joy of agroecology and food sovereignty coming together is that you've got these fantastic systems of growing more food and also governing the way in which that food is distributed so that it's good for everyone who is involved, other than the large corporations about which Phil is going to be telling us. But if people want to know more, I think my favorite organization that I'm currently encouraging people to look at is La Via Campesina is fabulous. But if you want an interesting example of how to fuse these two things together, of agroecology and food sovereignty, there's a terrific organization in Malawi called the Soil, Food and Healthy Communities Project. Soilandfood.org is the place to look. But thank you so much for having me on, Chaumtoli.
Thank you. Take care. So I do want to, Phil, can you hear us? I hope that we can bring you into this conversation. Excellent. Okay. Why don't you tell us, based on your experience around the GMO activism, how does this fit into food sovereignty? And just tell us about your work. I think, don't mind the questions. I think we want to hear from you because you have enormous amount of expertise. You've been a drafter with the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. You're a lawyer. So just tell us about your work and the GMO debate and how you've been involved.
Okay, thanks. That's very generous of you. There's nothing wrong with adopting foreign technologies, inherently wrong with it. But in the context, if we look at it, This is a kind of new colonialism, if you will. Technologies that were developed to change the genetic characteristics of food crops were not really done as any kind of an authentic response to the needs of either farmers in the global south or consumers there. And as we know, if we look at some of the examples, historically they have been very clumsy and very often inconsistent with cultural practices and with general mores. So we have a situation such as the Gates Foundation's intervention in all of this. And those of us here in Seattle are particularly concerned about that because we have certain responsibilities being in Gates' hometown to deal with the kinds of political favoritism that helps him promote these different schemes of his. So you have a very, very wealthy white man who knows nothing about agriculture, knows nothing about Africa, knows nothing about, or he must know something about food, I presume he eats, basically adopting policies and positions which are going to unbelievably impact farmers and consumers in other cultures, other countries, and so forth. And in addition, very often this work that is being promoted, and it's not just Gates, of course, but he is intimately, and the foundation is intimately tied in with the U.S. government and the big agricultural firms, Monsanto and so forth, on numerous international commissions, numerous national activities and so forth. This is not a conspiracy paranoia that I'm laying out. This has all been documented, and it's the basis on which we do our work. And it's a kind of new colonialism because it's forcing ideas that are not authentic or compatible with the cultures and the needs of people in the global south that are neat and nifty to a guy who believes that high tech is the solution to all the world's problems. So the GMOs in the United States have been totally and are totally unregulated and there's no oversight. And that was done through U.S. political manipulations, which I could talk about if you want, but I assume that that's not of primary interest to this audience. At any rate, the U.S. and the industry tried to waylay any kind of international attention to this issue. However, because the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed in Rio in 1992, contained a provision authored by the Malaysian delegation that said that countries should look into whether there is a need for any kind of international oversight of GMOs, and if so, what the modalities of such oversight should be. Under that provision, there was a fairly long period in which contentious issues were debated, meetings were held, and which finally in 1995 at a meeting in Spain represented a victory. There was a victory by most of the third world countries and civil society groups in a decision that yes, some kind of international regime was necessary. And that led to the negotiations of what became the Cartagena Protocol, 7 years of very, very tense negotiations. And as you know, the protocol came into force about a dozen years ago and has a number of provisions that are relevant to the food sovereignty issue and environmental concerns. I'll just give you one example of how it's currently being played out. The Cartagena Protocol recognizes the ability of any country to do a risk assessment of a GMO before that GMO is imported into the country. you could say that countries, of course, have this right inherently as they do, but the argument was made that under other international legal regimes, particularly the WTO, that right of restricting importation has been reduced or restricted, and that's a fair statement. So I'm not taking a position on whether that would have been upheld or not, but at any rate, the Cartagena Protocol says, look, states have this right. Now, it's very dicey how the interaction between the protocol and the WTO should operate. There are inconsistent provisions in the preamble of the protocol. But nonetheless, there's a whole risk assessment process. A big fight was whether or not social and economic considerations could be taken into account. Now, of course, we want that because we know that the economic, the environmental and issues can be sort of severe. We see that already in things like the reduction in the health of the monarch butterflies and so forth because of the as an indirect impact from the use of herbicides on corn, so that the milkweed weed, which feeds the young of the young caterpillars, has been substantially reduced and so forth. These are all indirect and what we call higher order effects. So, and the social effects are the ones culturally and so forth that I alluded to and that I'm sure that Raj and Sarah have been talking about. In terms of economic impact, the irony is, as our colleague Vandana Shiva said at these negotiations, this concern about trade and so forth is the economic interest of powerful groups. We would like the consideration to include the economic interests of the less powerful groups, the farmers, for example, in the third world. There is still, even though we got a provision, Article 26, which says that SECs, social and economic considerations, and environmental considerations can be included, there is still active current debate about what that means. So the protocol secretariat has a series of online, quote, expert consultations to deal with issues and come up with documents that will be discussed at the meetings of the parties, which occur every 2 years. The next one is in Mexico in 2016. And believe it or not, on the one dealing with Article 26 I'm involved in, people representing the U.S. government, the South African government, industry-affiliated scientists are arguing from the beginning that, as if we never had had this argument and the conclusion of the protocol language in Article 26, that the risk assessment doesn't have to deal with social and economic considerations. That's a separate and different thing. That's a separate and different thing. Now, the language of Article 26 was a compromise, and it says that the country may include SEC, but it doesn't say that it can't include it in the risk assessment, which is designed to determine that whether or not GMOs should be allowed in. And the reality is that very often indirect effects in any kind of inaction are much larger and much more consequential than a direct effect. And the whole notion under WTO that you can't have restrictions on trade, et cetera, is all about the indirect effects of a local regulation that a country might adopt. Nonetheless, they argue this as if it was never discussed, never decided, and the struggle goes on. I mean, there's like no end to it because of the power of the industry, the power of the Gates Foundation, the power of the U.S. government. The U.S. government has its minions in capitals around the world constantly telling ministries of agriculture there's nothing to worry about, constantly telling parliamentary committees on agriculture and food and health that there's nothing to worry about, etc. So, in many ways, while the achievement of the protocol was really a great victory, and we realized that it was a circumscribed victory. We did not win every argument for sure. But it was certainly something that the industry did not want to see, and that the U.S. in particular, as well as the Canadian government and now the Argentinian government, etc., and the South African government, are not happy with. It is up and functioning, and it is an arena, contested terrain.
You've given us an enormous amount in terms of your key role in the drafting of the protocol and sort of being mindful as to the politics around it. And while there are legal victories, there's a lot of on-the-ground activism that needs to happen. So unfortunately, what I would like to do is I would like to have both of you just give thoughts, and if there are any sort of burning points you want to incorporate, and then invite you both to come back and let's continue this conversation, because I think that we've just really begun in terms of the definition, but there's a lot to cover. So I think that just in the interest of those who are listening and the participant time, what I would like for both of you to and with Phil, giving him the last word, is just briefly, just kind of concluding thoughts.
Great. Yeah, well, maybe I'll just talk about, I feel like, there's a lot of common threads. One thing I did want to bring out more is just what the connections around racial justice are, around the food justice and food sovereignty, with a couple of examples. I think internationally, clearly the movements that are facing a lot of the injustices in the food system are in the global south, and that's because of imperialism, which is connected to racism. But also in the U.S., I think there's a real history of the way that the food system has oppressed Black people, Latinos, indigenous peoples. So, of course, the founding of the U.S. taking over indigenous lands, the actual slavery being a system that exploited horribly African peoples and African Americans, and Latinos being brought here to work as farm workers after the farming on their own lands in their own countries was devastated by things like free trade. So I think we're seeing a lot of really exciting forms of resistance from those communities in the U.S. I want to just point to that. For example, in Detroit, there's the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which, even though they say food security, they're also really about justice and sovereignty. And they've been taking back land that had been abandoned in Detroit when people gave up on Detroit and said, you know what, we can build this back for ourselves, and we can create community farms and our own food systems. That's really been a model for a lot of urban agriculture around the country. I know groups in Boston, where we're based, learned from what was happening in Detroit and said, hey, we have to bring that back here. We have to take over vacant land in communities of color to be able to grow food for ourselves. So that's, I think, really important and is part of a resistance to racism. I think there's groups such as Community to Community, a farm worker organizing group in Washington State, Farm Workers Association of Florida, Border Agricultural Workers Project. These are all organizations that have been organizing farm workers not only to challenge the ways that they're exploited on the job, that they're, have huge health risks from pesticides, and that they're not getting paid well. But they're also saying, well, what would happen if we controlled our own food production? What if we could create our own, both community gardens, but also our own collective farms and make decisions about how we produce, what we produce, and in a way that's also economically just? I think that's also about racial justice. Indigenous communities, from the Indigenous Environmental Network, a group called Black Mesa Water Coalition in Arizona, just a couple of examples of how indigenous peoples in the U.S. are reclaiming their sovereignty, with food sovereignty as a part of that. So native seeds and traditional practices around water conservation and beekeeping, and just a whole range of methods that are really deeply rooted in indigenous culture and are really important for the health of our food systems and the planet. So we're seeing a lot of inspiration from those communities that are most impacted, and looking forward to continuing to grow together with them.
Great, thanks, Sarah. On
okay, I really appreciate what Sarah said, and of course support the views and the observations that she has been making. I'm going to address. You asked me really to focus in on a narrow segment of the food sovereignty problem, where I have a lot of historical experience being involved in these negotiations and so forth. So let me just, while it won't be a kind of comment or riff on what Sarah just said, I hope folks can see this as a kind of complementary series of issues and observations. And I'm going to talk about three things that are relevant here. One is what we call biopiracy. The second is the laws and regulations in countries of the global south. And the third is having to do with research on health, safety, environmental aspects of GMOs. Okay, the first thing, biopiracy is a term which may be familiar to folks, but maybe it's not. So let me just say that generally it has to do with foreigners coming in and claiming control over a genetic resource of a country. And they can do that in very different kinds of ways. There are historical examples where there was a Belgian guy who found a kind of geranium growing in the little tiny nook in a valley in Costa Rica, and took out all the genetic samples he wanted and then destroyed the patch of geraniums and went back to Belgium and, developed a line of geraniums to be sold in the supermarkets in the spring and so forth. That's a very simple kind of example. What I see biopiracy is, an extension of the old colonial dynamic in which countries north and their industries, their protected industries would come into countries in the south and basically get control, well, first under slavery of the human resources and of course then the mineral resources and then the land resources now. And it's sort of like now the genetic resources, because I will just remind folks that when it comes to genetic wealth and to biodiversity, all countries are not created equal. And some of the smallest ones, like Costa Rica that I mentioned, and many of the ones in Africa, tropical countries, have huge biodiversity compared to the very, very limited biodiversity in countries like the Scandinavian countries and Canada and so forth. So part of the whole trade of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is, okay, the North can get limited access under certain terms to the genetic resources of the South, and I hope folks see immediately how this is related to food sovereignty. But in return, the countries of the South have to get benefits. Now, I will say in very general terms that this notion of access and benefit sharing has so far developed to facilitate access, and facilitating benefit sharing, not so much at all. And in addition, the CBD states very clearly that the genetic resources are the property of the state, not of the tribe or the farming village or the local people in that particular area that may have been growing and cultivating and nurturing this genetic strain for millennia, but no, of the state government. So sometimes biopiracy is now occurring not in the blatant kind of way of the Belgian guy in Costa Rica, but in very legal kinds of ways, very much removed from the dynamic of local groups, very much away from any kind of control and even knowledge of civil society. And that leads to the second point, the changing laws. This is going on right as we speak right now in Uganda, for example. Tremendous pressure on the legislature to say, one, that things are safe and have been proven safe in countries like the U.S., which of course is false because the U.S. does not do safety testing of GMOs. And again, getting these countries, the South, to change their laws is just like the old colonial concessions that countries of the North used to get to countries of the South. The most obvious example is what happened in China in the 19th century. Of course, it's just can stand in for what happened in many, many countries since then. And so, falsely claiming knowledge and pacifying people who are concerned in third world countries in the South about, we're taking care of this and so forth and so on. It's an entry for these economic interests of the North to exploit further the resources of the global South. And finally, of course, there has been some research showing problems with GMOs, essentially done by independent scientists whose curiosity and knowledge of the situation led them to try and amass skimpy resources to do some work and have come up with showing tremendous problems, risks and so forth. And instead of a rational scientific, international scientific project that would say, oh, well, we should see if other labs can replicate this. We should see if we tweak the variables, what happens, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, the scientists have been unbelievably attacked by scientists who, with associations with industry, with by publicists, by governments, and the like. And we have now a roll call, I will call it a roll call of honor, of people like Arpad Putzai, Terry Travick, Ignacio Chapelle, and of course the last French study showing that possible tumor growth in rats and so forth. And the attacks are designed to squelch intellectual investigation of this, investigations which would better inform civil society, consumer groups, farming groups, as to what kinds of policies would be best to effectuate their own needs and their own interests and so on. So I offer these kinds of areas as very specific, maybe technical, maybe legalistic. Okay, I am a lawyer, but
I am too.
Complementary to the important social movements and trends which Sarah and Raj have been talking about.
You know, one of the challenges of being a moderator is that you know, just when you're getting good is when we have to stop. And so I want to thank all of our guests that we began on really topics that deserve their own attention. So GMO, and I'm glad, Phil, that you talked about the research and the law. I'm also a lawyer, so I think that those pieces are important. The activism, the work that's being done globally, and then being able to frame the issues as well in terms of, I think that what we've done is really begun the conversation. As I mentioned before, I would like to invite each of you to come back so that we can. Law at the Margins is committed to raising issues around food sovereignty. Would like to invite each of you to write on the website if you have time. So I think we're going to end there. If there are a dear with me, and I can put it onto the Facebook page. At this moment, I want to thank Albert Garcia, who is behind this consulting me in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I think Seattle, Texas, and I forgot where Sarah is at. I appreciate all the guests and participants for being patient with technology. I think Phil said it earlier, technology is not perfect. GMO technology is all sort of based in terms of human. And so, again, I want to thank our guests, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. So take care, and I think we're going to sign off tonight here in Dhaka, and I guess in the afternoon in the United States.